This is my impressions of Part 1 of the American Pageant, Chapters 1 through 8 for AP US History. So, my first impressions was the accidents that occurred. There's just so many accidents, whether they're ecological, social, geographical, or any other type. They really formed our history. And as we were reading, I just thought, and we discussed it in class, I thought that, just the accidents are shaping our history. But then I kind of came to the conclusion that accidents are our history. So I have two analogies for this, and the first analogy is, a highway with detours. So behind each detour is kind of a piece of land that you can't really get to, or in history's case, what could have been. But then each detour, no matter what it is kind of like an accident, and it forces us off to a unique path that wasn't there before, and that's our history as we know it today. And then a second analogy is a tree, a tree with branches. So each branch kind of represents an accident or something that happened, and they all kind of come together to form the whole, the tree, which is our history as we know it today. So an example of a geographical accident that occurred was the Indians coming to the Americas. So if that land bridge hadn't been present, who knows what history would have been like today? Would there have been humans in the Americas? We don't know. Would there have been as much development, or would the agriculture be the same way in North America or South America or the Caribbean islands? We don't know. What would have been like when Columbus had come? Like what would have been different? So it's just kind of showing that one thing can affect everything else. An example of that also is Columbus, which is a social accident. He had a lot of pressure on him to deliver, but then he was also kind of greedy on his own. So what would have happened if one of those things had been different? How would have Columbus been? How would have he had acted when he came to the Americas? So that's just kind of showing that accidents, one thing can affect everything else. There was an ecological accident, like the Indians couldn't get into cities really, but they also had things like three sister farming, which helped increase the population. There's just so many different things that make a larger whole, and without one little thing, it's like pulling a brick out of a pyramid. Like everything else can come tumbling down. I think the main accidents that happened was the war, the Revolutionary War itself. There's so much that could have gone differently. Like the colonists actually lost more battles than they won. Yet they had the help of the French. What would have happened if, say, the French couldn't have been able to help, or the Spanish wouldn't have been able to help? Like they made it like a world war, which helped divert British troops, which was critical to the success in the war in the colonies. So it's just kind of showing that the war itself was kind of one big accident. Anything could have, like one little thing could have been different. Like George Washington, like if he caught a cold and then from that like it developed into some sort of like disease or something, like if he died, what could have happened? Like one little thing could have changed everything. Like each piece was critical until like into building what we are today and what our history is today. The second thing I noticed in this chapter was kind of the pettiness and the selfishness and the immoral character displayed on both sides, through the colonists and the British. So, the British, there was people like Lord North and other such people like him who were kind of, didn't really want to listen to the colonists and wanted their own thing and wanted rule over the colonies. But on the colonist side, for example, when they're arguing for taxation without representation, some of them didn't even want representation because they knew they'd get outvoted in Parliament. So they were just kind of arguing for the sake of arguing. They also didn't even give representation for all the people in the colonies, which is kind of ironic. So it's just kind of, this reading just kind of showed that there's a lot of pettiness on both sides, which leads into my next point, that the authors did a great job in part 1 of showing that there's no such thing as good and evil on opposite sides. Everything's kind of a mix of it. So like on the colonist side, you have people like Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere and people like him, George Washington, great leaders. But then you also had, the people who would tar and feather other people and would abuse the loyalists. So that's just kind of showing that on the colonist side, not everything was like, this is the righteous side. But then on the British side, it was also the same. You had good generals who were just fighting for their country, but then you also had people like William Pitt. But then you also had the bad people, like Lord North and people like that. History isn't really good and evil on both sides. Everything is a shade of gray. So that's another thing I realized when I was reading this chapter. So my overall impression on part one of the American Pageant was I thought the authors did a really good job displaying the accidents and how not everything is black and white. It's all kind of shades of gray, and telling a really unbiased side of the story.